Good morning, you're watching World News and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. European countries want lasting peace in Ukraine, not a ceasefire, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said after the emergency Paris summit on Monday. More on the meeting in the French capital and the upcoming peace negotiations in Saudi Arabia in just a moment. On Monday night, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said that defense spending will not be considered in the EU's excessive deficit procedure. Speaking following the emergency EU leaders meeting in Paris, Tusk added that all the attendees had similar views on the issue and agreed to the importance of cooperation within NATO.
A very important confirmation, especially for us, that defence spending will no longer be treated as excessive spending. So we will not be threatened by the procedure of excessive deficit, which has its unpleasant consequences. And this is an important change. I won't say revolutionary, but in the history of the European Union, this is a very serious step forward in terms of the logic that Poland has been talking about for many months at various meetings in Europe.
Last evening, Emmanuel Macron reaffirmed the need for strong security guarantees for Ukraine. In a message posted following the conclusion of the emergency EU leaders summit in Paris, the French president said that without such measures, the new ceasefire will end up just like the Minsk agreements.
We seek a strong and lasting peace in Ukraine. To achieve this, Russia must end its aggression, and this must be accompanied by strong and credible security guarantees for the Ukrainians. Otherwise, there is a risk that this ceasefire will end up like the Minsk agreements. We are convinced that Europeans must invest better, more, and together in their security and defence, both for today and for the future.
In a video statement following the emergency summit in Paris, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that U.S. security guarantees are the only way to deter Russia from attacking Ukraine once again. In a statement, Starmer also reiterated his readiness to send British forces to Ukraine if a peace agreement is reached.
On defence, it's clear the US is not going to leave NATO. But we Europeans will have to do more. The issue of burden sharing is not new, but it is now pressing, and Europeans will have to step up, both in terms of spending and the capabilities that we provide. On Ukraine, we're at the very early stage of the process. Europe must play its role, and I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again.
Following yesterday's emergency meeting of EU leaders in Paris, NATO Secretary General said Europe is ready and willing to step up to its responsibilities. In a social media post, Mark Rutte went on to add that the continent is ready to invest more in security and provide guarantees for Ukraine.
Ready and willing. That's my take from today's meeting in Paris. Europe is ready and willing to step up, to lead in providing security guarantees for Ukraine. Ready and willing to invest a lot more in our security. The details will need to be decided, but the commitment is clear.
Wrapping up his trip in Brussels, Donald Trump's envoy for Ukraine, Kellogg, will meet with the president of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen on Tuesday. Although the agenda for the meeting has not been released, much of it will likely revolve around Ukraine. Later in the day, Kellogg will be hosted in Warsaw by Polish President Andrzej Duda. The Polish president will use the meeting to express his country's point of view on current geopolitics and the situation in Ukraine. Duda's office says that authorities in Warsaw are in close contact with their American counterparts, and the meeting is not extraordinary in nature. Nevertheless, it also marks the first time General Kellogg meets a foreign head of state face to face. Today, senior American and Russian officials will hold talks on negotiating an end to the Russian war in Ukraine. This will mark the most significant meeting between the two sides since Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine nearly 3 years ago. The United States will be represented in the Saudi Arabian capital by the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff. They will discuss possible solutions to the war in Ukraine with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Vladimir Putin's Foreign Affairs Advisor Yury Ushakov, and the head of the Russia's Sovereign Wealth Fund, Kirill Dmitriev. According to Russian authorities, the meeting will be purely bilateral and will not include Ukrainian officials. The talks mark another step by the Trump administration to reverse Joe Biden's policy of isolating Russia. They're also intended to pave the way for a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin has released another U.S. national from detention ahead of talks between Russian and American officials in Saudi Arabia. According to reports by the New York Times, the 28-year-old man had been detained over cannabis-laced marmalade in his luggage. Kayla Byers-Swain, the U.S. national in question, was detained at Moscow's Vnukovo airport during a baggage check on February 7th. Custom officials found small amounts of cannabis inside his luggage. This marks the second American prisoner released from detention in Russia in recent weeks. Wayne's jailing also coincided with negotiations leading to the release of the first American prisoner, Mark Fogel. Speaking on Monday in an interview with German broadcaster ARD, Volodymyr Zelenskyy said American officials being accommodating toward Vladimir Putin is a problem and warned of Europe's military preparedness for the war. The Ukrainian president then went on to say that although Europe increased military spending, it remains weak in terms of the size of the armies, navies, and air forces.
The problem is that the US is saying things today that are very unpleasant for Putin. I think that's the core of it, because they want to please him. Do you know what for? To meet each other and have a quick win. But what they want, a just ceasefire. That's not success. I think Europe is weak today. Europe has become stronger in these 3 years. Production capacities have increased, technological strength has been improved, readiness has increased. But in terms of troop numbers and the size of fleets, air forces and drone units, I honestly think that Europe is weak today.
A Russian drone attack was launched against Kyiv overnight. While the country's capital was shaken by several explosions, no casualties were reported. The attacks targeted the northern parts of the city, but the incoming UAVs were engaged by Ukrainian air defense units. Debris from one Russian drone reportedly fell in a non-residential district of Kyiv, sparking a fire at a warehouse and setting nearby cars ablaze. A group of Democratic and Republican U.S. senators has visited Kyiv to discuss security guarantees with Ukrainian lawmakers. Members of the American delegation say there is bipartisan support for offering Ukraine strong security guarantees, as well as involving Europe in the negotiations.
The bipartisan group in Congress that supports Ukraine and a positive resolution believe that we are not going to see any kind of negotiated end to this war unless there are security guarantees that people feel comfortable about. We saw what happened in 2014 when Russia came in and we weren't tough enough. We saw the war start again in 22. We saw what happened in Georgia. And so I think those security guarantees could be done in a variety of ways. That's part of what this negotiation is going to be about. And I think the United States will have a role in that. I think Europe will have a role, but that's ultimately to be decided by any negotiation.
I believe, first, we should understand that this is just the beginning of a dialogue. There is no specific framework that's been mapped out yet, and we expect that will come to pass very quickly, we hope, and that Ukraine has to be front and center as a part of the negotiations to make sure that it's something sustainable.
It's too early to discuss our contribution to send German peacekeeping troops to Ukraine, said a spokesperson for the German Defense Ministry. She added that if a proper framework for sending ground troops to Ukraine is put in place, Berlin will take part in the operation.
These comments come just a day after the Munich Security Conference concluded.
We have repeatedly said that we must first wait and see whether and how peace will hopefully be achieved for the Ukrainians. And then we will be able to talk about the conditions and how this can be structured. But basically, we think it is still premature at this stage.
Although no decisions have been made yet, the German government has called for a joint effort from both the EU and the US when it comes to the possible presence of peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. Germany is now less than a week away from a federal election that will see new leadership take on European security challenges.
It's a big security concern having discussions about Ukraine and without having the European Union at the table, said Moldova's Deputy Prime Minister for European Integration, Kristina Gerasimov, when asked about the upcoming Washington-Moscow peace talks and their impact on the Central and Eastern European region.
Security concern, having discussions about Ukraine, without having the European Union at the table. Moldova is a very small country. It's still a fragile democracy, though a very ambitious one that sees itself, its future in the European Union. However, the security situation in the region, should it deteriorate because of a decision on behalf of Ukraine, without having Ukraine on the table, that directly affects our security as well. Anything that affects Ukraine directly affects Moldova as well. We are part of the same region. We share a very long border with Ukraine. Anything that impacts the security of Ukraine impacts also the security of Moldova. All of the discussions for the next weeks and months ahead of us on reaching a peace deal for Ukraine has to be done with Ukraine's participation, with the European Union member states' participation, so that we reach a just peace deal that is a sustainable solution for the overall European security architecture in the future.
The EU General Affairs Council is gathering in Warsaw on Tuesday. The meeting is held as part of the Polish presidency in the Council of the EU. During the gathering, the interior ministers of EU countries will discuss hybrid threats that the EU member states, as well as countries aspiring to join the bloc, are currently facing. Strengthening European military and civilian preparedness is also on the agenda, as are plans for the multi-annual financial framework for 2028 and beyond. All 80 passengers and crew on board a plane that crash-landed before flipping over at Toronto's Pearson Airport in Canada survived the disaster. Emergency services said 18 people were injured, 3 of whom are in a critical condition but not life-threatening condition, as the aircraft overturned as it touched down in windy conditions on Monday afternoon local time. U.S. carrier Delta said the flight from Minneapolis was operated by its Endeavour Air subsidiary. It had 67 passengers and 4 crew members on board. Airport officials said earlier on Monday that the facility was dealing with high winds and freezing temperatures as airlines attempted to catch up with missed flights after a weekend snowstorm. Canadian authorities have launched an investigation into the cause of the crash. Pope Francis has been hospitalized for treatment of a complex clinical condition, says the Vatican. The head of the Catholic Church is reportedly suffering from a polymicrobial infection of his respiratory tract. The Pope was initially checked into a hospital in Rome last week for diagnostic tests related to a respiratory tract infection. The results obtained indicated that the 88-year-old pontiff will require further hospitalization. Polymicrobial infections are acute and chronic diseases that can be caused by a combination of viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites. And so this marks the end of our service, but please do stay tuned here on TVP World. Back in just a moment with another interview.